A wise man once said that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Another man, less wise, said that if you hit yourself in the head with a hammer, then you will crack your skull open. And that seems to be what Celtic did against Rangers last week. Welcome along to the Huddle Breakdown. Enda here in the company of Alan Morrison and Juco James. As always, lads, how are you getting on?
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Hanging in there.
So, James, myself, and yourself hopped on the podcast, hopped on YouTube to discuss this game in the post match of it, the post emotion of it, the anger of it, and this is the analyzing of it. So, I guess we'll start off with you and things that you've learned in the last 3 days since the game and what your take is on it now in comparison to what it was directly after it.
So some of the interesting aspects of it analytically were the tale of two halves. This comes back to one of the topics of debate within kind of data and analytics relative to football is this concept of game state. And, the fact that if you look at the data of the game, Rangers pretty much dominated the first half. Obviously getting the 2 goals, and a question comes in naturally, which is, okay, well, how much does that impact the rest of the game relative to strategy? Did Rangers change how they were playing because they had that 2-goal lead to defend? Probably. I mean, again, we don't know, but that's obviously a reasonable thing to think could happen. Because in the second half, then really Celtic took over the game from a chance creation perspective. So if you kind of break down that game in the game, as they say, obviously goals change games, and that was certainly the case from a game state perspective. Interestingly, that second half was, from a chance creation, one of the best periods that Celtic have had relative to the Gerrard tenure at Rangers. I think the total XG for the game was over 2 from a non-penalty perspective. And almost all of that was in the second half. A very small fraction was in the first half. But the problem we've had really since Kennedy's come in, and again, there's a lot of debate, I think room for debate as to why that might be. Some of it may just be randomness, is the finishing's just been terrible. So despite the relatively high chance creation, I think the post shot XG and Allen's might be a little different, but it was, like half of a goal plus or minus around there. So, so when you look at the sum of the parts at the end of the game, it actually looked like an okay performance underlying, but I think that probably masks it a little bit relative to that game state. The fact that, Rangers got those 2 goals in the first half, and I think for the most part set up to play fairly defensively and counter. Generally it worked because we didn't score, but we certainly had a lot of chances in the second half, and it very well could have been a different game had we, picked up a goal, whether it was on the Welsh opportunity late in the first half or one of the myriad of opportunities in the second half.
Alan, one of the reasons that we were kind of excited about this game was the fact that it was a cup game. It was a once-off. The league form doesn't really matter all that much when you go into these, and it was the last remaining fixture that actually mattered for Celtic this year as such. So we were excited, we were hopeful, and we were emotional as well. And again, myself and James were quite emotional after the game, but you watched this game emotionless because you took it a little bit of a different approach to it than we did.
Yeah, not by choice, and not because I'm somebody who's devoid of feeling. It was just that circumstances were on Sunday that I had a family birthday event all afternoon, was outside. I'd avoided the score. I had no means of recording the game. I don't have Premier Sports. And then, Celtic TV decided to, it's probably contractual, the reruns not till like midnight on Sunday. And I'm just like, am I going to go through all of Monday, working, not finding out the score? And something popped up on social media, I think, one of the many bloody channels that you get, even though I'd ignored everything all day, that just gave me an inkling that things hadn't gone well. So I pretty much looked at the score, I saw the result, and just didn't bother to watch it until I obviously started collecting the data. So I was watching it pretty much without that, without going through all the trauma that it must have gone through actually to watch that game, because what a nightmare actually in terms of, you were right. I was pretty upbeat last week about it, mainly because I sensed perceptible improvements in what I call coherence of the team, culminating in that Livingston game. In terms of a lot of weaknesses in the side, Kennedy had appeared to make very subtle adjustments to mitigate, especially Brown's role being more curtailed, the fullbacks being asked to keep it simple as far as ball distribution was concerned. El Yunusi obviously hitting some form, the return of the diamond. Welsh has been steady. There was enough in there that you felt, okay, we look coherent, we look confident. And that was a big, we actually scored some goals in a game where we made lots of chances, and that, as James said, hadn't been happening a lot of the time this season. And then on the other side of the coin, I just felt, there's evidence in their performances that the XG differentials in their game has been getting lower and lower, and in fact in some games has been not in their favour. At some point there had to be some variance that didn't go their way, whether it be a referee call, an injury, even one of their players getting booked quite early and putting them under pressure. Just doesn't happen. So I felt that if we could make a good start and put them under pressure, then is there a little bit of mental and physical fatigue on their part, because again they've played a very settled team all season because they've had no injuries, they've had miraculously little to no COVID impacts, etc. So for all those reasons, I chose to be hopeful about the game. But obviously conceding a goal again early allowed them to play in the way that they want to play. As I said before, they're essentially a very solid defensive team, and having a lead to defend absolutely suits them down to the ground. This comment about they look like they're playing within themselves, I just think that's how they play. They have quite a relaxed way of playing, actually. It's not high tempo, it's not high intensity particularly. They do press sometimes, but they choose their moments quite carefully. And the early lead just allowed them to play their game, which was to keep very compact. And actually they did make an adjustment. They made an adjustment because in the last two games against Celtic's Diamond, they've actually looked like they're under pressure a little bit. But again, all the variances have gone their way. So they went to a pretty regimented 4-4-2, pushed Kent right up alongside Morelos, and really tucked in midfield and kept it really narrow. And they let Kenny and Laxalt have the ball. They let Welsh have the ball. They let Brown have the ball, and then they absolutely hounded anyone else who got near the ball. And that was pretty effective when you have a 1-0 lead to defend. But apart from that change to their approach, what was remarkable about this game was how few surprises there have been in terms of all the things we've spoken about this season. It was just, in some senses, it was an utterly predictable match. And what I mean by that is, our fullbacks were incredibly limited on creating something. Although I will come back to Kenny, because I think I saw him getting an awful lot of criticism during the game. So having only watched it once to capture the data, not watched it in sort of full-on throwing things at the TV mode, I didn't particularly see that. I just thought he performed pretty much as he's performed in every game, which is pretty solid, not particularly spectacular, but actually he created 2 chances and he had the highest packing stats of anyone in the team. So to me, Kenny was pretty good. On the left, it was a disaster. Yeah, Laxalt offered nothing. Taylor offered nothing going forward. That's predictable. That was in what we've seen all season. Brown was too slow in midfield to stop danger and was easily turned and easily ran past on a number of occasions. We've seen that all season. McGregor was distracted by supporting him and offered very little going forward. We've seen that this season. And, Edouard and Christie, just in all honesty, do look like they've pretty much, down tools is a very sort of, not a very analytical term, but their performances are just not in keeping with what we've come to expect from them. So, and the substitutions didn't particularly help or add to the performance. And in fact, there was no attempt to change the shape or adjust the performance or the approach to counter this very compact 4-4-2 that that they were able to settle into very early because again, you know, there's an absolute again. This goal was the first goal was a rerun of many goals that we saw earlier in the season, where Brown gets overrun in midfield. In this case, it was Welsh rather than Duffy. Charges out to try and do something, be seen to do something. So he charges out. That doesn't work. Laxalt actually entered the frame in the picture just as Aribo took a shot, and he was still not in front of the ball. He was still the wrong side of the ball, and that was quite some seconds after the ball had been lost in transition in midfield. So basically, you end up with Ayer and Kenny trying to hold it together in the middle, and everyone else trying to recover. And then, of course, the shot, which could end up anywhere, ends up, sitting up perfectly for Davis on the edge of the 6-yard box. I mean, we talk about variance. These are the sort of things, that shot could literally have gone anywhere. So none of those things, all of those things are exactly what we've seen all season long and hadn't changed.
Yeah, there's a lot in that, because that basically sums up the entire match. But I suppose coming into this game, one of the things that we were talking about was the starting lineup. Maybe James Forrest, if he was fit, it would be a 4-2-3-1. Maybe it would be the diamond if he's not. And then there was the conversation around Laxalt and Greg Taylor. What we ended up with was the diamond with Laxalt at left back, Brown at the base, and Edouard and El Younousi up front, like we saw them against Rangers in January. And I mean, as I said at the start of the show, that if you take a hammer to your head, that you're going to crack it open. And Celtic know at this point in time that if you play Brown at the base of a diamond with Laxalt and the other fullback, be that John Joe Kenny or Jeremy Frimpong earlier on in the season, that Celtic are going to get absolutely overrun in midfield and struggle with the centre-backs having to fill positions that they shouldn't have to fill because the fullbacks are too far up. And that's where the goal came from, number one.
Yeah. But I mean, that had been... We hadn't seen a goal conceded like that for quite some time, since Kennedy did go for it, to be fair, because that hasn't happened. The fullbacks have been more circumspect. There has been a conscious effort to keep more of a back four shape, which is just basic stuff, to be honest with you. I don't know why it never occurred to anyone before. So I was surprised. I mean, in all honesty, I would have picked Laxalt. Because I think I've seen him, my perception of him under Kennedy is he's played a much more disciplined game. He's simplified his game. His distribution was much more straightforward. He's giving less of the ball away. He's not getting forward as much, which may maybe part of the reason why Celtic aren't creating as many, scoring as many goals. But on the other hand, it removes some of that risk around the transition. So I was okay with that, because as we saw in the second half, frankly, Taylor struggles against any physicality and pace. He just can't. He's not that level of opponent. He just doesn't perform like he does against Ross County and Hamilton. That's just that isn't going to change, because he's not physically going to get bigger and stronger. To add to what is a lot of good attributes about his game, but you can't make him that much quicker, and you can't make him that much stronger.
No, James. Fullbacks were a big talking point at the end of the game, so I guess maybe we'll start our breakdown with that. John Joe Kenny and Laxalt. Now, Alan, you might disagree. I don't know. I think John Joe Kenny did not have a good game, but Diego Laxalt certainly did not have a good game.
I'm actually heartened to hear Alan's characterization of Kenny, because I rewatched the game as when I'm in real masochist mode. I rewatch it the same day at night. And the thing that really struck me relative to Kenny, and Alan obviously captured it in his data. I don't record data when I'm watching. I just kind of take some notes sometimes, and both written and mental. And Kenny really did play a number of line splitting passes to Christie. I mean, real good, linking up with even Brown on a couple of occasions, where, got the ball forward, took out a lot of players, and created either directly or indirectly, kind of the next pass and the next pass, very rapid transition. And that was part of when we started to create chances in the second half. A lot of that occurred. I think, he took risks. So you saw that upside. And this comes back to, as I always say, confirmation bias. It's kind of like what happened with Ball and goalie. once people have anchored their emotional view of a player, then they almost, they feel the bad stuff more than they note the positive stuff. So I think because the rhetoric and the narrative around Kenny has gotten to be quite negative every time he gave the ball away. And, this is kind of, we've talked about this with Christie as well. And again, I don't think Christie had much, a great game either. So I'm not saying that in this game, but generally speaking, Christie's a more risk-taking player. If you've got a negative bias against him, you're going to feel every time he gives the ball away more than you are when he, makes a good pass and creates a chance or one of his good crosses. So I think what happened with a Kenny performance was, he did give the ball away quite a bit. That's because he was taking risk with his passing. So generally speaking, I didn't think he was terrible. I think, as Alan said, I'd agree. It was kind of a, run-of-the-mill Kenny performance, which, again, I don't think is up to standard for Celtic, but it wasn't an absolute train wreck. Laxalt's was more so. And I think, the fact that the solution for this issue was to, the solution coming out of the first half was to sub Taylor, given what went on in the first half. The issues with, I think the first goal was kind of an over anxious Laxalt who saw a breaking McGregor in the half space. And that was just bad fortune to a degree, meaning that he almost got parallel with McGregor and was very high up. It looked like, a real break that was unfolding. And then McGregor just screwed up. And this gets back to this issue of resilience in the system I talk about, right? So that started a cascade of a chain link of events where then, everything goes wrong and the risk factors that were there cascade in a nonlinear way, meaning that Laxalt got aggressive, McGregor makes a mistake, Brown dives in, he's too slow, and then Welsh dives in, and then you throw on a little bit of bad luck with where the shot goes, and that's kind of the story of the season.
Yeah. Sorry, James. I was just going to just to supplement that. It's not completely unscientific. What I was going to add is my observation on watching all levels of football is if you do three things wrong in a row, right, you often concede a goal or a very good chance. Three things in a row. Look out for that, and that happened in this instance, and they conceded a goal.
Yeah, and it was. To me, the issue that was obvious in the game again, and we saw it all through the Europa League, is just the level of athleticism and the deficit that Celtic have, both in a size, but just pace. I mean, Patterson, regardless of what you think of him, for him to be the age he is, with the size that he is, his height combined with the guy's clearly been working out, you know what I mean? Like he's lifting weights. You can see that he's got some definition and muscular build, and he's got pace, and he's functional, at least from a technical perspective. I mean, he was blowing by our players. Aribo was blowing by our players. Aribo, again, big, athletic, fast guy. Kent, not as big, but man, is he athletic and fast and quick. So if you go right down the line here, Kamara, same thing. So, the disparity in athleticism, I thought, and I've been saying this for a year and a half, relative to Rangers, between height, build, and speed. I mean, it was just, if you're competently coached and you have a structured system and you have a technical advantage, like that can balance that out, obviously. But that's really what, Rangers' advantage has been, even within Europe, is they field a very athletic team. They're probably not quite as technical as their opposition most of the time, but they're well structured to leverage that athleticism and in a very structured system. And that's hard. When you have athletic people that are well trained and cognitively advanced, I mean, in a system that they are playing well, that is really hard to compete against. Mm-hmm. And that, when you create risks within that context, and that's basically, what we're talking about here, back to what the fullback problem was, and in these transitions, that's why I always harp on Brown with transitions, is, that creates the risk. That transition are where risks lie. And when you combine a deficit in athleticism with some of these other risks that occur, I mean, that was the game, basically, is that every time they broke, it was like, it's like back to Dundee in September last year, early in the season. And what we talked about with Livingston, even, where it was a 6-0 game. And I said, wow, but yeah, did you see those transitions again where there's space, and anyone, any team of a decent level is going to carve that open. There's just too much space being left. And that's where you see this sliding scale that every time, I actually posted about it on Twitter today, in the games where Browns played against anyone in Europe, Hibs, Aberdeen, average XG conceded has been over 1.5.
Yeah.
And like there's only been 1 or 2 games where it's been below 1. I mean, it's been reliably and consistently bad. And it's because we've been getting absolutely crushed in transition because we don't have the athleticism to stop the counterattacks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that was my biggest frustration with Kenny. Not that he was giving the ball away or anything like that. I just saw 3 or 4 moments where Barisic was there for the taking, go past him, knock the ball past him, and get into that space. And he couldn't do it. And Greg Taylor couldn't do it either when he came on. And like you want to say that Laxalt has that athleticism, but again, his weaknesses aren't that. His weaknesses are elsewhere, and they were exposed too. Alan, what was the data saying about Laxalt compared to John Joe Kenny?
Yep. So again, we're saying that Kenny, James is agreeing. I think had a pretty solid game. He defensively, they were similar in terms of their duels success. Probably, I would call it par at best. I think, obviously with Laxalt, the issue has been, he's just not there. He's not in the picture when you expect him to be in the picture. You're asking, it used to be where's Bolly, now it's where's Diego, where's Wally? Honestly, where the hell are you? You should be stood in that quadrant of my screen at this second, and you're not. Where are you? So there's that. In terms of ball possession, kind of 80-ish% passing each. They both had similar number of possessions won and lost. But where I think the difference was creatively. So Kenny had 2 key passes, which meant his passes directly led to shots twice. He had 1 successful cross. He also had 1 secondary assist, so he provided the pass that enabled a pass for a shot. Laxalt had 0 across the board on all of those. Kenny had 7 pack passes, so taking players out of the game, and had the second highest pack rate in terms of who he took out of the game, how many players he took out. Laxalt had 2. Kenny at least had 1 progressive run. Laxalt had none. So Kenny had the highest expected assist rate outside of the strikers and Turnbull. So, that was pretty impressive. And he had the highest packing rate. He was the only one in triple figures, only one with a packing score over 100. The next best was Ayer, actually. It was Turnbull. I think Turnbull had a really good first half and then faded badly in the second. But so I think Kenny actually had, I would say, more than just a decent game. I think he was one of the better performers. But the left back position was very poor.
Yeah. So the last couple of weeks we've been going easy on Celtic. We've been starting off with the positives as opposed to the negatives, but we're diving right into the negatives for this because I'm almost craving it. I was waiting until we recorded this to see how bad the players actually were. So let's start with the duffer of the game as opposed to the boy of the match. So I will hold my opinion until I hear the data. So I don't know which one of you want to go first here.
Go on, James.
Yeah, I'll go first, and I'm going to give my duffer to McGregor. And it again, I like to use these at times to introduce a longer term issue into the equation. So I was on the pre-show chat for the 20-minute Tim show that they do before the game, and somebody had mentioned something about McGregor, is he ever going to get a rest? So I just happened to look it up on Y Scout. I was curious, because again, the club had bragged about how many minutes he had played one season and a couple years back, and I wasn't sure how many minutes and relative to peer group what that would have looked like. So I happened to do a search in all senior competition. So this is going to include international duty with Scotland, but he was second out of 439,000 players in the database for this season in minutes played. Second out of 439,000. So I didn't check it today relative to including the game from yesterday with Aberdeen. So he's got well over, a good bit over 5,000 minutes.
Who was first?
Harry Maguire, actually.
I thought it might have been, yeah.
Yeah. So, again, you even think about that. You got a center back versus a midfielder, and what's the wear and tear physically relative in those two positions. So, I mean, this guy has been absolutely run into the ground. It's amazing, actually. It's a testament to him that he hasn't been injured more. I mean, it's just incredible fitness that he's displayed. And we've talked about how much his performance levels have been harmed playing next to Brown in 4-2-3-1, improved a little bit in the diamond, but still, just not great. And in a game against Rangers where he played 95 minutes, and again, Alan might have a little bit different data, but he was involved in just 6 duels. Just 6. I mean, that's a rounding error level for a midfielder. It's like a ghost level.
I have the same number. I suspect it's calculated differently.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just one of these things.
Right. Exactly. So again, I think about these in context of, and they were all, he was in 0 defensive duels, as they would characterize it. So he just wasn't all that involved, and either creatively, defending, ball progression. So this goes back to system, coaching, leveraging your best players. And I joined the optimistic crew on our preview show on Friday. And then when I saw the selection of both teams Sunday, I tweeted that, basically my optimism had evaporated. And that's because I could tell by the way Rangers had selected their team with Aribo and Arfield that they were probably doing something different relative to tactics to combat the diamond. And Alan, I think, did a good job summarizing what that was. And it basically rendered McGregor a ghost, a combination of all of these factors. And we go back to, and I still firmly believe McGregor is one of our best players. And he should be empowered. Our best players should be empowered to do what they're good at. And that definitively did not occur. So, I have a hard time criticizing McGregor because he gets, he's like a mule that gets beat because he's played so much. So but his performance level just wasn't there. And I don't think it's all his fault. I think a lot of it has to do with how he's been utilized. And the fact that, like I said, he's just been run into the ground.
Yeah, it's a longer conversation for another day. But again, this plays into my anger of the loan system at Celtic, because I mean, there are games in Scotland. If there's a place in the world, in Britain, to develop young players, it's Scotland, because there are teams where you can take risks and play these younger players. Luke O'Connell plays in Callum McGregor's position. You could arguably play Ewan Henderson there as well. There are a couple of players that if you change the system around, you could give them opportunities and take ample opportunity to rest Callum McGregor and rest other players and give them a chance. That's an absolutely crazy stat. The 400 and whatever thousand. That's mental to me, especially for a midfielder. Like his injury table, or his injury list must be quite good. Like for a player who's playing so many minutes compared to some players who you can barely touch them, but their hamstring's gone again. Alan, your duffer is it Callum McGregor too?
So I can't disagree with any of that in terms of McGregor's performance. I just can't bring myself to call him out in any because he's frankly carried the team all season in my view. At a very consistent level of performance within the constraints of the role he has to play and what he's trying to do, covering for the fact that Brown can't get around the park as much. So I find I'd have a hard job singling him out in any game, but I can't disagree with that characterization of his performance. But instead, actually, the number I'm just looking through here, the numbers for my Duffer are almost identical across the board to McGregor's in that very relatively few defensive actions and the same kind of success rate. Slightly more recoveries, maybe. Slightly same number of defensive third wins. Actually, a few more possessions won, to be fair, but zero assists, assisting passes, 1 secondary assist, 2 pack passes, a couple of progressive runs, a couple of shots, both outside the box. Contributed the least expected scoring contribution of any of the forward players. In fact, of any of the players outside of Ayer and Laxalt, and that was Christie. He just was. He was the definition of invisible. And Christie, whatever you say, and I honestly don't know what's happening around future and where his head is, where he wants to be. Does he want to be Celtic? I don't know. But Christie, whatever you say about him, his performances are usually characterized by, a lot of effort. He tends to be the person that fills the most columns in my spreadsheet in terms of, he manages to put a 1 in at least everything at some point or another, good, bad, or indifferent, because he's just doing so much. It doesn't always come off because, as James said, he's a risk taker. So, not everything works for him. But this seemed like if you wanted to see the stats of a midfielder playing it really safe and not taking any risks and not really getting involved in the game, then that's what Christie's performance numbers look like, and that's completely a non-Christie performance. So for me, he was definitely my Duffer.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't mean to get personal with any player because I think Ryan Christie seems like quite a good lad, in fairness to him. But if his head is anywhere above the championship, then he needs his head examined, because I mean, if he's leaving Celtic, he's not going to a top Premier League club or even a mid-table Premier League club. He's just not. He's barely good enough for Celtic at this level, let alone a mid to high level Premier League side, in my opinion. Positives. Let's talk positives. Are there any positives from this game? Who is the boy of the match, Alan?
So this is quite fun because I'm going to be able to poke a stick at James here from across the Atlantic. So this will. I'm not trying to be cussed here, but this is honestly. I looked at the data after the game, as I always do, which is why I contribute. I don't really tend to contribute to these kind of immediate post-match reaction type things, because I often find, in all honesty, when I look back through the game and then look at the numbers, that my opinion of who has been the boy of the match has probably changed, actually, and is completely different to what I thought watching the game, and vice versa, and the same for who I thought hadn't performed well. And this was very much the case here. So this player had by miles the most successful challenges and interceptions at 13, which was 7 more than any other player. This player actually had won the ball back 5 times in Celtic's defensive half, which was 3 times more than any other Celtic player. 13 recoveries, was 3rd in the team. 10 possessions won overall, was 7 more than any other Celtic player. Still managed to provide 2 key passes that resulted in shots. Had 8 pack passes, which was higher than any other midfielder or attacker. So out of all the front 6, had the highest number of pack passes. And even though didn't have any shots on goal, my boy of the match was actually Scott Brown. I'm saying that it invalidates none of the opinions that James and I would share, which is that he shouldn't have been playing. None of that invalidates any of that opinion. But having played, and this is why this is such a sensitive subject, because this game is a perfect illustration of why it isn't a black and white debate about Brown in some senses. Or if you're Lennon and you don't look at data, there's plenty of evidence you could pull out, and as I have just done, that shows that why Scott Brown was actually the most effective Celtic performer on the day, and I believe he was. But it still doesn't change the fact that Celtic were overrun at key moments in that game in Brown's position, and that's where most of the threat came from. And that's not because Brown wasn't making an effort or wasn't, competent mentally. It's just physical degradation. He couldn't physically get there, but he made up for it in all these other regards relative to the other players in the team. So for those reasons, he was my boy of the match.
James?
I've the good, bad, ugly thing I do on the day after games. I think I haven't tabulated this, but I wouldn't be surprised if Brown hasn't been my kind of quote unquote man of the match more than any other player this season for the exact reason that Alan referenced, meaning that someone working hard and putting forth a lot of effort isn't always the best thing when it means over aggressiveness. And again, this comes back to one of the things that we talked about this season relative to just raw output in kind of counting stats for Brown, and the idea that he kind of chased some of that, right? And you can imagine this. I'm sure he's a prideful guy. He might be hearing people, a-holes like me, not me, but a-holes like me saying, quote unquote, your legs are gone, that kind of thing. I would imagine a competitive person, an alpha male type, might want to go out and prove those people wrong. And that may not be the most healthy thing, because, the exact reason why some of those counting stats are so good creates the ill discipline, the positional issues, the problems with transition, the chasing a ball like he tried to do with the first goal. I mean, that's exactly why his profile is a bad one for someone who's aging. Imagine Muhammad Ali not adopting rope-a-dope and going up against George Foreman and getting absolutely murdered, which is probably what would have happened if he tried to go toe-to-toe with George Foreman when they fought. So, as you age, you have to adjust your game. And we've seen that across sports. Michael Jordan did it. They've all done it. Kobe Bryant did it. LeBron James has done it. Regardless of sport, Messi is altering his game. Ronaldo altered his game. So as you get older, you have to alter your game a little bit. And that's, what we've talked about over and over again with Brown, is he kind of did under Rodgers, and then we've kind of had a back to the future. So I don't dispute that. I don't argue with Alan on that at all. I think he, relative to what, he can control, other than being more disciplined, right? And again, he's probably just not going to do that. And so I'm not sure how it makes sense he's going to Aberdeen either. I'm not sure Aberdeen should be, investing in a 36-year-old version of Brown, who I can't imagine is going to all of a sudden get disciplined playing for his buddy. We've seen that formula this past season. So yeah, I think relative to what he can do, I thought he was efficient for the game.
I'll offer my theory on why Brown hasn't adjusted his game, and the harsh reality is that I don't think he can at this point. If you look at the midfielders who have adjusted their game, take Andrea Pirlo for the prime example of this type of midfielder. Obviously, it was a little bit different to Brown in his normal days, but Pirlo, Xabi Alonso, both of them have unbelievable passing range. Brown doesn't have that, so he can't fall into the center defensive midfield player that just sits in front of the defense, sprays passes behind the defense, and gets in tackles where he can. He's not good enough to do that. And I think that's why, and I do think he's chasing the career that he had 2-3 years ago, and it's just not fitting for this level of football. You will get exposed.
Yeah, and we've talked about this in prior weeks. I think that this likely has been an issue that had a marginal impact that is increased, meaning that this has probably been an issue for years, literally years, when he played under Dyla, even all the way back to Lennon, first tenure, when you play better teams, meaning that you get punished when you're out of position against better teams. And that level of ill discipline and shape and chasing things. And now a version of him where he's older, significantly less quick. I mean, that's how you get the group stage that we had in Europa League this season is you have teams like Sparta that absolutely carved us wide open like we were a dead fish through the midfield. Mm-hmm. And that's because it really is that fundamental in my opinion. And we, again, we'll talk about it a little bit. We saw it again with Aberdeen last night. I mean, this is Aberdeen. Like we saw with Dundee earlier in the year. We've seen it with St. Johnstone and other level of teams where, if they just had a little bit better quality players, I mean, the opportunities are there. And again, mm-hmm. Rangers took it until they got up 2-0, and then they basically went into cruise control. This is why I talk about. I mean, Rangers probably could have kept doing it at a much higher rate had they been more aggressive in pushing the game.
Yeah, that's the worrying part for me is that, and some people have said it to us in the comments that Rangers didn't get out of second gear. And I think that is largely true. I just think that Rangers are at the point now where they are better than us. If you take the starting 11s, they're better than us in that sense, and that the longer the game went on, the more likely it was that Rangers would score like they did in the previous games, and Celtic would score. Just the way it was. As we round this off, then I couldn't bring myself to watch the Aberdeen game during the week. I don't know, Alan, have you collected the data from this game? Have you looked at it?
No, but I didn't realize that the little app that I've got on my phone that's like my football score app actually has like a bunch of data, a bunch of stats in it. I didn't even know for Scottish League games. So it was kind of similar in the So I'm going to slightly disagree a little bit, and I offer a little bit of hope. I'm sorry to come back to I know you asked me about the Aberdeen game, but I just want to try and offer another narrative that I could easily frame around the data. Now, there's an interesting point here. I want to just touch on a sort of technical point about expected goals model, because expected goals is now popping up in an increasing number of places. This was a very bad game to be evaluating. The rest of them, I'm talking about the Rangers game, very bad game to be evaluating single game expected goals models. And the reason I say that is you look at Celtic's expected goals based on the model I use, which is a very simple one. It was like 3.47. That's quite big. It's like Celtic's 5th biggest expected goals of the season. Now, that does reflect, to some extent, a lot of the chances that Celtic made, because Celtic had at least 4 chances where the player and the ball were in the 6-yard box. And with the balls and the players in the 6-yard box, it tends to elevate the percentage probability of success for that shot. But what a very sophisticated expected goals model would do would account for things like the height of the ball, was the fact that when Edouard had that volley, it was kind of slightly behind him. When El Yunusi had his initial shot, McGregor was right on top of him, and he was actually a little bit wider outside the width of the goals, that type of thing. So the actual chances themselves, I wouldn't have classified those as big chances, but the expected goals value in my model would have been very high. So I think my expected goals value of 3.47 is probably inflated, and again, it's a good example. That's why it's better you look over a much wider range of games to get a far more accurate picture. But having said all that, if you look at the other metrics across the game, the key things: possession, Celtic 55-45, expected goals, as I've said, 3.5 to 1, shots 16-9, on target shots 6-4, shots in the box 11-4, big chances I had 2-0, packing score 364 to 293, possession in the box 24-11, goalkeeping saves 3 for Bain, 6 for McGregor, another 6. That's 14 saves McGregor's made in 3 matches. Defensive errors, 2 to us, 3 to them. You look at all of those stats and you didn't know the score of the game, I would be guessing 2-0 Celtic. That's what I would. And I know that we've just talked. All that doesn't invalidate all the things we've just talked about. But when I was optimistic on Thursday, it was because of all these variances that seem to always go the Rangers' way this season, or variances that Celtic haven't been on the receiving end of this season. And hey, listen, 9 in a row, we've had some really good runs. The invincible treble season, everything was on our side. All the long shots went in. All the positive variances were there. And this season, it's been the opposite. So boo-hoo, poor Celtic, right? But I just thought that maybe in this game it would change. But those numbers, because you've got to remember, in context, right? This is probably the worst version of Celtic that we're going to see. And now you might think, well, actually looking ahead, we don't have a manager. We can see a lot of these players leaving. The ones that are really good that we rate are may well be leaving as well. So it could get a lot worse, you say. But in terms of what we know, the knowns, right? This is probably the worst version of Celtic. There's only 3 players in that team that played on Sunday that I would want to see starting next season, on the assumption that Edouard's just going to go, right? So this isn't anywhere near what I've said on this quite starkly on this podcast. This is not a good Celtic side. Mm-hmm. And yet you look at those numbers and you look at the fact that McGregor's made 14 saves. Celtic by post XG models were up around 3.5 for those 3 games compared to Rangers, and then you look at them. And I would argue this is the best version of the Rangers that there has been, and maybe couldn't pay 10 in social taxes. They bought Kemar Roof and Itin and others in the summer. So they've made no provision for some debts that are potentially coming their way. They've gone absolutely all in on this, and this is the best version. They've got a superb coach in Beale, and they've got a very settled team. They've had no injuries. They get no bookings. They get no sending offs. They get no penalties against. It is the best of the circumstances, the best of the variants. So I say all that because I do still take positives that the worst of Celtic, the best of them. And if you look at the data around the last 3 games, you could easily have seen 3 Celtic wins. So I still choose to hope.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I'll be the cynical prick that I am. To me, what that validates is, I started talking about in October that we needed competency and courage. So we needed to, I talked about putting Kennedy in charge as caretaker, and somebody's got to have the courage to drop Brown. And then if we did those 2 things, that the league was salvageable and that we could revert back to a performance level that we had last season. And to me, what we've seen since Kennedy took over is half of that. We got the competency. And that's, if you look at the talent and the quality we have in attacking players, and this is even with Forrest basically gone for the season, with all the issues that we talk about, we've been back to about last season's chance creation level under Kennedy on average, and that's with 4 of the 6 games against Rangers and Aberdeen. Okay, our problem has not been in creating when we have coherent game plan and a decent level, a competent level of manager. Our problem has been in goal prevention and concession, and this is why I keep harping on the same issue. If we simply would have entered this season with Julian and Ayer and Bolingoli and Frimpong, and we would have invested in a European level number 6 with everyone else the same, that is a team. It's the same reason I argued last season. That level of quality is a team that could go late into the Europa League. I mean, this version of Rangers went reasonably late 2 years in a row. Look at the teams that are in the final, that made the final 8 or the final 4 in Europa League.
Yeah, but again, positive variance. One draw against a top 5 league side. I mean,
sure, of course,
of course. You're not going to get that year on year.
I agree.
I take your point. I don't disagree with any of that. And that's kind of gone now, I guess. And we're trying to look forward, really. So
well,
the Aberdeen game was very similar.
Right.
But we scored 100th goal of the season. We still scored 100 goals this season, but we conceded our 55th or 56th. And to your point, for Celtic to concede 55, 56 goals,
Mm-hmm.
when we've not even played that many in Europe.
In a league where chance creation is down 20%. Yeah. So again, if you look at systemic factors, the lockdown, no fans, all of these issues that, of course, have had some impact on the game of football, the crowded fixture list, all of these things are systemic. And within that this way, if you I've looked at the numbers, I've shared them. If you adjust for that, Celtic are basically up 60% on a relative basis in XG conceded. So in a league that's down 20% in chance creation, Celtic are up 40. I mean, that's the convexity of that problem is based off of quality of opponent. And as we've gone into decent level players, the problem goes parabolic. I mean, God help us if I said this earlier, a couple of months ago, if we would have gotten it, somehow we would have on a miracle basis made it into Champions League with that team. You thought it was bad under Rodgers. I mean, my God, how you imagine this iteration going up against a Bayern Munich or a PSG. I mean, oh my God.
No, I don't want to imagine that, as I said before.
It can always be worse, Enda. It can always be worse.
It can always be worse. I always look at the negatives. I think one thing about this season, though, is more importantly to me, is that instead of looking at the goals we scored, 16 wins since I can't remember what period the 20-minute Tims tweeted out. 16 wins for Celtic. Celtic Football Club won 16 games against Scottish opposition. That is just unbelievably unacceptable, in my opinion. It's just you've got one team against you, and we've gotten beat by that team 3 times this season, and that's where I measure Celtic. That's where Celtic should measure itself. But that is the season over, essentially. Now with that loss, a couple of games left to do it. We will put ourselves through the misery of watching the rest of the games, will we? Is that?
Wait, someone has to correct the data.
Yeah. We might as well.
There's got to be at some point someone's got to start making decisions, and you start. Because the bug. James has got his bugbears. Mine is that it seems a surprise that we start European qualifiers when we do, and we're completely unprepared for them every single season. And this looks like it's going to be even worse.
Yeah. Oh God. Yeah. Somebody asked me on Twitter, would I like a summer league, because they play a summer league in Ireland as well, but with the European fixtures, we're badly enough prepared as they are. The European fixtures going into the qualifiers, that'd be the only positive that Celtic could take from playing in summer leagues, that they might actually be ready to do so with all their teams. As we recorded this, obviously Patrick Kamala has left the club, so we might touch a little bit about him and his departure and what he brought to the side in his very little time on the pitch. So we might talk about that next week. We'll return with some sort of podcast, would be that a match review or a special of some sort, focusing on some players. I think we said we were going to do a Ryan Christie one, so next week might be the week to do that. James, Alan, thank you.
Thanks, guys. Talk to you next week.
Yeah.
All right, cheers for listening. We are the Huddle Breakdown. You can find us on Twitter at Huddle Breakdown, or on Spotify as well. You can get us everywhere you get your podcasts. Every Thursday we'll be back again, same time, same place. But until then, we'll chat to you later.